If you'll allow me, I would like to welcome on behalf of all of the organizers, His Excellency Timothy Lenderking, the U.S. Special Envoy for Yemen. He will give the keynote remark on the situation in Yemen and the progress of the peace process. Mr. Lenderking is known among diplomats in the Arab world, in the Gulf, and in Yemen especially, and he became the U.S. Special Envoy to Yemen around a year ago in February 2021. He's also the Assistant Deputy to the Minister of Foreign Affairs for Iran, Iraq, and regional and multilateral affairs in the U.S. Department of State. So over to you, Mr. Lenderking.
Well, good morning, all of you from Washington, D.C. Thank you very much for having me this morning. I am really honored to be with you. I think it's a tremendous program that you're putting together here, and I look forward to being a part of it over the course of the 2 days, even though I will speak briefly only this morning. And I'm really touched by the poem that was cited here, and just a couple of messages already that have been imparted about the tragedy. I mean, it's just, it's a tragic situation that is gripping Yemen, and we all have a tremendous responsibility to bring it to an end, bring this conflict to an end, and to work in a realistic way and in a hopeful way. And I appreciate very much the message about moving forward. That is indeed what we must do. And I want everybody to know of the U.S. commitment, my personal commitment to doing just that. I think it's past time that we made progress in a way that brings this conflict to a close. So thank you very much, Sultan Barakat and Rafat El-Akali, Dr. Khalil, for your invitation and for hosting this event. Very much looking forward to the conversation, which I think, we, myself, my team will learn a lot from as well. We don't have all of the best ideas, and we need more ideas by committed people, and particularly committed people inside Yemen. Let me begin first by reiterating our commitment, the commitment of the United States to helping improve Yemeni lives, creating the space for Yemenis to collectively determine their own future, and to advance a durable resolution that ends the conflict in Yemen. We're not talking about a ceasefire only here. We're talking about ending the conflict and helping Yemen get back on its feet. This remains a top U.S. foreign policy priority. My team and I started this year by traveling to the Gulf to urge the parties to de-escalate and also to protect all civilians, to support a UN-led, more inclusive peace process, and to do more to address the humanitarian and economic crises. In terms of humanitarian assistance, the United States has provided the people of Yemen more than $4 billion since the crisis began more than 7 years ago, nearly $214 million for COVID-19 pandemic response for refugees, internally displaced people, vulnerable migrants, and host communities, and more than 300,000 vaccine doses delivered through COVAX since December 2021. But we recognize that is not enough. The United States remains concerned with the UN's estimated $3.9 billion funding gap in 2022, and we continue to urge donors to fulfill their pledges to the people of Yemen and to step up to give generously. In terms of U.S. economic support, we continue to advocate with other partners to provide economic support to advance critical reforms, to address the issues of salaries, infrastructure, and to address the fuel crisis. At this time, we are in a state of escalatory military action by the parties. Let me take this opportunity to reiterate that the United States does not support a military solution. And from my engagements with our international partners, they do not either. There is no military solution to the conflict in Yemen. The United States, along with the international community, continues to urge the parties to de-escalate. and we cannot stress enough the responsibility of the parties to abide by their obligations under international humanitarian law, including those related to the protection of all civilians. Let me be clear, when we speak of protection of civilians in the region, we also include the thousands of US citizens living in the Gulf whose safety is the top US national security priority, and our detained locally employed Yemeni staff in Sana'a, whose safe release we are committed to. When we look at the Houthis' offensive in Marib, including repeated attacks on civilian areas in Marib and attacks against internally displaced persons camps, we conclude that the Houthis' Marib offensive over the past year has been the primary obstacle to peace efforts. However, Houthi recent losses in Yemen should indicate to them and to all the parties that there is no military solution. We've also seen the Houthis threaten to strike international commercial airports and other targets in Abu Dhabi and Riyadh. This concerns the United States and the international community greatly. The Houthis have pursued a dangerous pattern of increasingly obstructive and aggressive actions against Yemenis, Yemen's neighbors, and the entire international community, harming civilians and civilian infrastructure. We've seen the Yemenis put out alerts warning civilians of further upcoming attacks. We remind the Houthis of their obligations under international humanitarian law, including those related to the protection of all civilians. But we are also deeply concerned by any attack that results in civilian casualties, and we condemn attacks by all parties that lead to escalation and extend the conflict. So the violence really must stop. Over the past year, US diplomatic efforts have translated into two important building blocks to pave the way for peace in Yemen. First, we have growing international consensus on the need for a ceasefire and a political solution. Second, we have momentum around an inclusive peace process that takes into account diverse views across Yemen and seeks to amplify the voices of the vast majority of Yemenis who are calling for an end to the fighting. I've been personally engaged with a range of Yemeni groups, including women, youth, persons with disabilities, and civil society leaders, to promote a more inclusive peace process and amplify their calls for peace, justice, and accountability, as has UN Special Envoy Grunberg. We are listening to these diverse Yemeni perspectives to inform this process and amplify the voices of Yemenis. After years of a costly and brutal offensive, and particularly following the recent shifts on the battlefield, it should be clear to everyone that continuing to pursue the Houthi offensive in Marib will only bring more suffering. It should be clear to everyone that there is no military solution. This could provide, and I'm very hopeful about this for this year, an opportunity to pivot to dialogue. The United States feels strongly that that dialogue must be Yemeni-led, and that the role of the international community is to create the space for Yemenis to come to the table and put the pressure on all of the parties to help make this happen. This is at heart a Yemeni conflict, and a durable Yemeni-led solution is needed to end the conflict and reverse the humanitarian crisis. I remain hopeful that with will from the political parties and the conflict parties and from the international community's joint efforts, that these two building blocks, the growing international consensus for a ceasefire and a political solution, and the momentum around a more inclusive peace process, can pave the way for peace in Yemen this year, 2022. Let me assure you all that the United States remains committed to this mission and to a realistic pursuit of a resolution of this conflict. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to join you and help you launch this very important and timely conference.
Dr. Sultan, please unmute yourself.
Dr. Sultan, your microphone seems to be muted.
Sorry. Thank you so much, Mr. Lenderking, for this excellent opening statement. Everyone believes in the capacity of the United States and the role the United States can play, hopefully to bring this conflict to an end within this year, as you've suggested. There are a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of work to be done in terms of placing strategic pressure on various actors, but also in terms of creating opportunities, given the side proxy that is developed around the Yemeni conflict. We'll come to this and other issues during the discussion time. And we'd like now to move directly to Mr. Mohammad Al-Amrani to invite him to speak on behalf of the government. Sayyid Mohammad Al-Amrani.
Mr. Mohammad Al-Amrani, I would like, if you'd allow me, to welcome Mr. Mohammad Al-Amrani, the Director of the Technical Office for Consultations and a member of the Government of Yemen's negotiating team. He will present the perspective of the Yemeni government and its vision on the peace process. Mr. Mohammed, please go ahead. Hello, everyone. Thank you all very much. I thank you from Aden. I would like to thank Dr. Sultan. I would like to thank Dr. Khalil and Mr. Rafat, as well as His Excellency Special Envoy Tim Lenderking. I'd also like to thank everyone at Deeproot, at the Arab Center in Washington, D.C., and the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies for inviting me to speak and for focusing on this vital issue and on Yemeni issues, especially since these issues have only become more complicated, that will need obviously a lot of research and studies to look into. There are many things that I could talk about, but I would like to focus on the most important points that I believe are necessary and core to the conflict in Yemen in the recent past. I believe that the political process in Yemen has been absent. The political process has been completely stopped almost since 2018 with the last meeting in Stockholm. Afterwards, the consultations and the talks became more indirect. And since the very beginning, just the fact that the Houthis come to the negotiating table required prices and concessions. Sometimes the government would pay, sometimes the coalition, and sometimes the special envoy themselves. There was delays in Biel, they were absent in Geneva, and they were late in Kuwait, and until Stockholm, which was the last point of the peace process or the meetings between us. There was a very clear absence of the Houthi side because and their intransigence in being there in person. And recently, just the fact of meeting the Houthis face to face would require concessions, would require allowing fuel ships to enter, would require other things that had to be provided as concessions, whether by the government or the special envoy, just for them to get an indirect meeting with them.
During the last year and the years before that, there was a state of, let's say, the illusion or the political misleading of the international community that there is a political process in Yemen, but there wasn't actually. We were just focusing on the small things, but avoiding the big important things. And the international community continued to deal with the scene in the form of different briefs from the UN Special Envoy, or a brief debriefing every month, and the briefing has become a purpose by itself. What obstructed the political process? I can refer to a number of points here. The first point is the nature of the Houthis, the ideological nature of the Houthis. Actually, they have a philosophical position that is being strengthened and promoted by them. And this position relies on the divine right they have, they believe they have and creating a generation that is chanting the chant of slogan of death, a generation that believes that the death is the message of life and that violence is the only solution for the Yemeni crisis. This is one of the basic complexities that have not been carefully studied by the UN Special Envoy, the international community, and others. They view the Yemeni crisis as a conflict, it's a proxy war or something like that. It's not. The problem of the Yemeni identity and stealing or plundering the Yemeni state and the republic and avoiding the key principles in Yemen and the Yemeni heritage and legacy that we have, all this were eroded in front of the Houthi movement, and the international community did not view that. The international community thought that exercising pressure on Saudi Arabia will end the war. Well, this war will continue regardless if Saudis leave it or not. This is related to the Houthi ideology and their motives. And this is one of the key complexities in this conflict because you cannot win a war against a person who believes that he has supremacy. The other point, which is an extension for the first point, is that, as you know, the peace process requires two parties having the same determination and will to put an end to the conflict. If there is one party that is refusing to engage and to provide any concessions or to do anything in order to end the conflict will continue because we have an absent party or actor. There is no partner in the political process in Yemen. The Houthis, they have opted the track or the path of war, and they are not relenting. I can just remind you of the military truces that were declared different times, and they are revoked by the Houthis very quickly because the Houthis believe that the absence of the Air Force will help them to expand militarily. We have had the Stockholm Agreement and the Houthis attacked Hujur and then Nehem. While we were discussing the joint declaration, the Houthis are trying to invade Marib and they are attacking Saudi Arabia. And therefore, the Houthis believe that war is their way in order to win. The third point, which is a key complexity here, is the Iranian agenda in the conflict. Iran is a state or a country that is trying to create mayhem in the region through different militias. They are they are affiliated with Iran, and this is an issue. The affiliation of the Houthi militias to Iran is problematic. I remember in the last conflict in Marib, actually, we have had some indirect talks with Saudi Arabia in Oman, and we were receiving some messages, some understandings were approaching actually, but then there are Iranian orders that change the process and the path of the Houthis. So the fourth point, I believe, it has become a challenge for us, which is that the Houthis are trying to double the cost of the war in order to double the cost of peace. So for every military adventure, there are victims. In Marib, I believe there are about 25,000 or 30,000 deaths from the Houthi side. And this is making the situation more complex for the peace process because the cost of peace is excessive. And therefore, you will see that the Houthis are trying to evade any agreement or binding agreements. They do not sign any agreements. In the Stockholm Agreement, they did not sign it. In the Kuwait consultations, they had some conditions not to sign anything, just to reach verbal understandings. And therefore, they are trying to avoid any binding agreements. There are also other remarks concerning the performance of the different UN Special Envoys, the subsequent ones, and sometimes their behavior was problematic because it does not allow us to reach final solutions concerning the Yemeni crisis. the idea that the special envoys continue to talk about progress and that there are good intentions. No, this is not right. There was no clear message to enlighten the international community about the obstructing party. All the briefings presented to the UN Security Council were trying to balance and to condemn all the parties equally. And here I'd like to salute Mr. Lenderking because he is saying things clearly. He is not praising the government, but he is saying to the international community that one of the problems we have is that there is a military that is on the attack, on the offensive, and this is not stated by the UN Special Envoys. They are trying all the time to have to strike a balance, and this serves the agenda of the militia, because it is appeasing for the militias to tell them that you are not wrong. We have another issue, which is the references. I think the most complicated 2 points concerning the Yemeni file are the following points. One, the legitimacy of the state, and the second is the firearms. We say that these references are very important because one of the key foundations for sustainable peace in Yemen is to understand the impact of the war. We should not recognize the spoils and gains of war because we will be recognizing the de facto authorities, and this will not result in a durable solution. This is a reward for the party that is opting war. And therefore, not recognizing the military gains is very important in order to have a durable solution in the country. The third point is that there was an attempt to just focus on the details on the account of the big strategic issues. For example, the economic situation. I was member of the economic team. We had Mr. Ahmed Shami, I believe you have him as a panelist, a human rights activist under the title of a human rights activist. He was representing the Houthis in the past. Anyway, I meant to say that the central issues concerning the peace process are not there. In the past year, for example, all the movements or initiatives were about the exchange of prisoners and confidence building measures. And this is avoiding the key and critical issues in the conflict that are supposed to be in the core of the discussions. There is also another very important point, which is that there is no leverage from the international community and the UN Special Envoy on the Houthis. Everyone is trying to exercise pressure on the government because the government has relations with the international community, and the government is respecting its international commitments. And the Arab coalition is also respecting the principles and its international commitments. The Houthis are trying to portray themselves as the fierce party, and therefore everyone is trying to appease the Houthis in order to be realistic. This includes the international NGOs, the UN Special Envoy Office. Everyone is trying to appease the Houthis, and this is not leading to the right political process. I don't know how much time I have. I think your time is over, so please try to be brief. We have had very bad experiences in the past with the Houthis. Actually, the issues were not defined well on the negotiations table, and I would like to conclude with a question. Was the problem in the war itself or in the management of the political process? The price Yemenis pay today, is it a result of the war itself, or is it a result of not resolving this war? I mean here that the international community has decided to not allow this war to exist, but it has not decided to produce a true peace in Yemen. And therefore, things remained in stalemate, and the issue of peace is not resolved. The issue of war is resolved. Yes, everyone does not want war, but there is no clear peace roadmap or peace plan. and therefore war continued for 7 years. We have not resolved it by peace or by war. And this doubled the cost. It's not the cost of the war, but it is the cost of the mismanagement of the peace process. So this is what I wanted to say. I had other things, but I may add during the Q&A session. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mohammed, and I'd like to thank you for providing the clarifications concerning the key factors that obstructed the political process. We have written some of the points here, and we will come back to them in the discussions. This conference is primarily for the presentation of some academic papers, and you will see some of the academic colleagues. They produce some balanced studies and research. Many of the things you have raised are addressed in their research. Tomorrow we will have an opportunity for Mr. Abdul Malik Al-Ajri to speak on behalf of the Houthis Ansarullah concerning their perspective about the political process. But if you allow us, we have some minutes now for the discussion, and I will start taking some questions that I already received through the Q&A. And it is worth mentioning that we have 250 participants and we have a lot of questions. So I will choose some of them. There is a question here that is important from Abdurrahman Ali. And Abdurrahman says, why the previous negotiations are not evaluated in order to understand the reason behind the failure of these negotiations in order to take that into account in the future negotiations. This question, as indicated by Mr. Mohammed, he referred to the issue of Stockholm and the Stockholm Agreement in 2018. In this session, we also have the special Swedish envoy to Yemen, Mr. Peter Semmenby. And if Mr. Peter wants to comment on that, what are the lessons learned from the Stockholm Agreement or the Hodeidah Agreement that was signed in 2018, and how can these lessons be applied to the future? We also have Mr. Mohammed. If you want to add comments to this, you will have the floor. So sadly, Mr. Tim Lenderking, he has to leave to another meeting and he won't be with us anymore. So Mr. Peter.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to participate as a panelist here. It's a very interesting program and a very interesting list of participants. Quickly on Stockholm, I think one should keep in mind that Stockholm actually did achieve quite a bit in the sense of preventing a potentially devastating humanitarian disaster if the fighting had continued in Hodeidah. It also established a United Nations presence on the ground in Hodeidah that still remains today as the eyes and ears of the international community that has arguably had quite a strong de-escalatory impact in the time since then. Then, of course, Stockholm failed to achieve the agreed mutual relocation of forces, and which would also have had a further confidence-building impact between the parties. There could possibly have been further efforts put into the implementation of the Stockholm Agreement in order to ensure this. I think this is a lesson to be looked at. But first and foremost, I would like to emphasize what I said first, that the most important part of Stockholm to halt the fighting against the background of a humanitarian imperative, that purpose was indeed achieved.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Peter. Thank you also for joining us. We look forward to your input throughout the coming couple of days. Another question that has come up on the list here is about or related to the concept that is often put forward in this kind of negotiations, and that is it is Yemeni-led, Yemeni-owned process. فالسؤال هنا هو بالنسبة للدور إنه هل هذه
The question here is that these talks should have Yemeni ownership. So I don't know if Mr. Mohammed, we still have him. We still have Mr. Mohammed. It seems Mr. Mohammed is disconnected.
Okay. معناه إذا سمحت لي بيتر نرجع لك مرة
Okay, if you allow me, Peter, I'll come back to you because of given your experience about the talks and the negotiations about Yemen, the issue of the ownership of the talks.
Yemeni-led, Yemeni-owned. ما إذا كان عندك مثلا أي ملاحظات عما تم
If you have any comments concerning what has been done in Stockholm concerning the ownership.
Well, this is, of course, a question that is much more complicated than it looks on the surface. It's a matter on the one hand of Yemenis to adopt a mindset that is geared towards negotiations rather than gains on the battlefield. And this is something that the Yemenis can only do themselves. At the same time, there is a role also for all the external actors to give space, as Tim Lenderking said initially in his intervention, give space to the Yemenis to solve their problems, to take a step back from the regional competition or confrontation that is undeniably being played out in Yemen itself. But that being said, when that happens, when the external actors take that step back, then it will become the responsibility of the Yemenis to put peace on the top of the agenda, not further gains on the battlefield, and to clearly realize what the alternatives what the alternatives are. A deeper humanitarian crisis, suffering, and further fragmentation if they do not take this leap of mind, I would say.
Great. شكرا جزيلا أستاذ بيتر.
Thank you, Peter. And it seems that we have reached the end of this session, which was an opening session. We won't have time for more questions, sadly, during this session. So we will take a break of 10 minutes, and then we will come back for session 1 of this academic conference. And the session will be moderated by my colleague, Muna Hidayah. We'll come back at 5 o'clock. It's 10 minutes from now. So on behalf of all the organizers, I would like to thank again Mr. Tim Lenderking, Mr. Mohammad Al-Amrani, and Mr. Peter Semenbai. Thank you, and see you in 10 minutes.